The ship was dying, and so was the man inside it. Commander Elias Voss sat in the pilot seat of the Briar Rose and watched the warning lights flash red across every panel. The FTL coil had cracked 6 hours ago. Life support had dropped to 40% and was falling. The oxygen recycler made a sound like a sick animal every time it tried to cycle, and the heat was bleeding out of the hull so fast that frost had already started to form on the inside of the windows. He was somewhere deep in the Valith Nebula. No trade lanes, no relay stations, no colonies for 100 light-years in any direction. He had been hauling medical supplies to a settlement on the fringe of human space when the coil blew, and now he was drifting in a cloud of purple and gold gas that was beautiful enough to be the last thing he ever saw. Elias pulled his jacket tighter and watched his breath come out in white clouds. He had sent a distress beacon 4 hours ago. He had not expected anyone to hear it. This part of the nebula was empty. Everyone knew that. The trade maps said so. The navigation computers said so. The old pilots at the fleet bars said so. Everyone was wrong. The first sign was a light, not the cold light of a star or the distant flicker of a relay buoy, but a warm light, soft and blue-green, like something alive. It moved through the nebula gas in a slow, graceful curve, and then another appeared behind it, and another, until a whole line of lights stretched across the darkness like a chain of glowing pearls. Elias leaned forward and stared. His sensors were half dead, but what was left of them told him he was looking at ships. 7 of them. They were not human. The ships were made of something that looked like grown crystal and living metal. They curved and spiraled in shapes that no human shipyard would ever produce. Their hulls pulsed with bioluminescent light that rippled like breath, like heartbeats, like the slow rise and fall of something dreaming. They were Ilori. Elias knew almost nothing about them. Most humans did not. The Ilori were a quiet species. They kept to themselves. They were scholars and healers and singers of strange psalms that traveled through gravity itself. They had no military. They had no empire. They moved through the galaxy in small convoys, studying, learning, and helping where they could. Most species considered them harmless and unimportant. The convoy slowed. Then it stopped. A transmission came through on the emergency channel. The voice was soft and layered, like 3 people speaking at once in perfect harmony. Terran vessel, we have received your signal. We are changing course to assist. Please hold. Elias stared at the speaker. He had not expected anyone to answer. He certainly had not expected anyone to stop. Stopping in the deep nebula was dangerous. The gas interfered with navigation. The longer you stayed, the harder it was to find your way out. And these ships were clearly on their own course, heading somewhere that mattered to them. But they stopped anyway. The largest Ilori ship moved close, and extended docking arms made of something that looked like coral and glass. Elias felt the gentle thud of contact, and then his airlock hissed open, and the warmth came flooding in. They were tall. That was the first thing he noticed. The Ilori were tall and slender, with skin that glowed faintly from within, shifting between pale blue and soft green like light moving through deep water. Their eyes were large and dark and kind, and they moved with a grace that made every step look like part of a dance. Their leader came aboard first. She was older than the others, and her glow was deeper, steadier, like embers instead of flame. She introduced herself as Matriarch Solara Venthal, and she looked at Elias with an expression he would never forget. It was not pity. It was not curiosity. It was simply concern, plain and open, the way a mother looks at a child with a fever. "You are hurt," she said. It was not a question. Elias tried to stand and collapsed. The cold had done more damage than he realized. His body was shutting down. The Aelori caught him before he hit the floor. For 3 days they worked on his ship and on him. Their engineers studied the human FTL coil with careful, patient hands, and rebuilt it using techniques Elias had never seen. They sealed the hull breaches with a living resin that hardened stronger than steel. They repaired his life support and his oxygen recycler and his navigation array. Their medics tended to him with the same quiet dedication. His biology was alien to them. They could not feed him their food, so they synthesized nutrient paste from their own limited rations, spending hours calibrating the formula until it was safe for a human body. They gave up supplies they needed for themselves to keep him alive. Solara sat with him during the worst of his fever. She placed her hands on his forehead, and her bioluminescence shifted to a worn amber, and something in that light made the pain ease. She spoke to him in her own language when he was too delirious to understand any language at all, and the sound of it was like music played on water. 2 of the Aelori fell ill from the strain of the work. They had pushed themselves too hard, given too much. The convoy fell behind its schedule by days. They would arrive late wherever they were going, and the cost would be real. They did it anyway. On the 4th morning, Elias woke up clear-headed for the first time. His ship was repaired. The Aelori convoy was already detaching, their crystal ships pulling away like petals drifting from a flower. He scrambled to the communications panel and tried to hail them. He wanted to thank them. He wanted to offer something, anything, payment, a promise, a favor owed. Solara's voice came back one last time, gentle and warm. "You owe us nothing, Commander. You were alive. That was reason enough." The channel closed. The convoy disappeared into the nebula like ghosts made of light. Elias sat alone in his repaired ship for a long time. Then he looked down and found something on the console. A crystal shard, small enough to fit in his palm, with Aelori script etched into its surface. He would later learn it was a traditional Aelori farewell gift, given only to those they considered worth remembering. He flew home. He delivered his cargo. And then he told everyone. He told the trade guild. He told the fleet bars. He told the colony workers and the dockhands and the merchants and his family. He carried the crystal shard on a cord around his neck every day for the rest of his life. And whenever someone asked about it, he told the story again. The story spread through Terran space slowly, the way all true stories do. Not through news feeds or official channels, but through voices. Through captains telling crews, and crews telling friends, and friends telling strangers in bars on distant stations. Every human who heard it remembered it. They would remember it for a very long time. Velundra was the kind of world that made travelers fall silent when they saw it from orbit. Its oceans were the color of liquid silver, and its land was covered in cities made of living coral that grew and changed with the seasons. Great towers of crystal rose from the shores like frozen music, catching the light of the twin suns and scattering it into rainbows that danced across the water. The air smelled of salt and flowers that had no name in any human language, and if you stood still long enough, you could hear it. A low, deep hum that came from everywhere and nowhere, the sound of the planet itself singing. This was the home world of the Aelori, and it had been at peace for over 4,000 years. The Aelori did not build weapons. They built libraries. They built gardens that floated on anti-gravity platforms above the coral cities. They built schools where their children learned to sing in harmonics that could bend light and shape gravity. They studied the stars not to conquer them, but to understand them. They reached out to other species not to trade or to bargain, but to share knowledge and offer help. They had no army. They had no warships. They had never needed them. That was about to change. Matriarch Solara Venthal was old now. 19 years had passed since she had stopped her convoy in the Valeth Nebula to save a dying human cargo pilot. She no longer led convoys. She sat on the High Council of Velendra, and her glow had faded to a soft, steady light, like a candle burning low. But her mind was still sharp, and her heart was still kind, and when the first reports came in from the outer sensors, she was the first to understand what they meant. 400 warships had entered the system. They belonged to the Dominion of Rak. The Rak were an insectoid species that had spread across an entire arm of the galaxy like a plague. They did not colonize worlds. They consumed them. Their ships stripped planets of minerals, biomass, water, and atmosphere, and when they were done, they left behind dead rocks floating in empty space. They called it harvesting. The rest of the galaxy called it what it was, but did nothing to stop it, because the rock were powerful, and the rock were many, and the rock did not care about diplomacy. They had looked at Velendra, and seen a world rich in bio-resonant minerals, the rarest and most valuable resource in the galaxy. They had looked at the Aelori, and seen a species with no military, no allies strong enough to matter, and no way to fight back. They had classified the entire civilization as harvestable. The Vanguard fleet filled the sky above Velendra, like a swarm of black metal insects. Their ships were ugly and functional, built for one purpose only. They blocked out the twin suns, and for the first time in 4,000 years, the coral cities stood in shadow. Solara stood in the council chamber and watched the darkness spread across the windows. Around her, the other council members spoke in rapid, frightened voices. Some wanted to negotiate. Some wanted to flee. Some simply stood and stared, unable to believe that this was happening to their world, their home, their people. Solara said nothing for a long time. Then she walked to the communications array and began sending messages. She sent them to every species in the galactic community. She sent them to governments, to alliances, to federations, to anyone with the power to help. She described what was happening. She asked for assistance. She appealed to treaties, to shared values, to basic decency. The responses came back one by one. The Korvathi Federation sent a formal statement condemning the aggression and promising to raise the matter at the next session of the Galactic Assembly, which was scheduled for 3 months from now. The Neth Combine expressed sympathy, but explained that their fleet was committed elsewhere and could not be redeployed at this time. The hegemony of Os did not even bother to be polite. They said that the Dominion's expansion was outside their sphere of interest, and wished the Aelori well. Wished them well. Solara read each response with a face that showed no anger, only a deep and terrible sadness. She had lived long enough to know that the galaxy was not cruel by nature. It was simply afraid. The Rock were powerful, and standing against them meant risk. And risk was something that governments avoided the way water avoided high ground. The first bombardment began at midday. The Rock did not send a warning. They did not make demands. They simply opened fire. Beams of superheated plasma fell from the sky like burning rain, and the coral cities that had taken centuries to grow shattered in seconds. The great crystal towers exploded into clouds of glittering dust. The floating gardens fell from the sky and crashed into the silver oceans. The libraries, with their millions of years of accumulated knowledge, burned. The Aelori fled underground. They had deep caverns beneath their cities, natural formations in the coral bedrock that had been used for meditation and ceremony for thousands of years. Now they became shelters. Millions of Aelori crowded into the dark spaces, holding their children, singing soft harmonic lullabies to keep them calm, while the world above them died. Solara went underground with her people. She held the hands of the frightened and spoke gently to the grieving, and tried to be the steady light that her people needed. But inside, she felt the weight of despair pressing down on her like stone. No one was coming. The galaxy had heard them and turned away. Then a young Elori named Torin found her in the deepest cavern. He was a cultural attaché who had spent years working with other species, trading poetry and music and stories. He was shaking, and his glow was flickering with fear, but his eyes were determined. "Matriarch," he said, "there is one more signal I can send." He explained. There was an old relay buoy at the edge of the system, decommissioned years ago, but still functional. It was pointed toward a region of space that most Elori had little contact with. But Torin had friends there. He had traded stories with their merchants. He knew their communication frequencies. "The Terrans," Solara said quietly. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a long time. She thought of a nebula 19 years ago. She thought of a dying man in a broken ship. She thought of the crystal shard she had left on his console, and the words she had etched into it. "Send it," she said. Torin worked for hours to route the signal through the old buoy. The rock bombardment shook the ground above them, and dust fell from the cavern ceiling, and twice the power failed, and he had to start again. But he kept working, and finally the signal went out. It was not a formal request. It was not a diplomatic communication. It carried no promises, no offers, no leverage of any kind. It was just a voice in the dark, reaching out to anyone who might be listening. The message was simple. "This is Valandra. We are dying. If anyone remembers us, please." Torin sent it, and sat back and stared at the console, and did not know if anyone would hear it, or if anyone would care. Above them, the sky burned. The coral cities crumbled. The silver oceans turned gray with ash. And somewhere, impossibly far away, the signal raced through the void toward Terran space, carrying with it the last hope of a gentle people who had once stopped in the darkness to help a stranger because he was alive, and that was reason enough. The signal arrived at the edge of Terran space at 0347 station time on a Tuesday. It hit a listening post on the outer rim first, a small automated station that floated in the dark and did nothing all day except catch stray transmissions from deep space. The station's computer flagged the message as non-standard and forwarded it up the chain. It passed through 2 relay hubs, a communications satellite, and a military filter before it landed on the desk of a young signals officer named Patel at Fleet Command on Earth. Patel listened to it once, then she listened to it again. Then she put down her coffee and called her supervisor. Within 20 minutes, the message had reached Admiral Kira Tanaka. Tanaka was 53 years old and had served in the Terran fleet for 30 of those years. She was not a woman who showed emotion easily. She had commanded warships in 3 engagements, negotiated with hostile powers, and buried friends without flinching. But when she heard the message from Valandra, she sat very still for a very long time. "This is Valandra. We are dying. If anyone remembers us, please." She knew that name. Every captain in the fleet knew that name. Tanaka pulled up the file. It was old, but it was thorough, because the man who had created it had made sure of that. Commander Elias Voss, cargo hauler, deceased 7 years ago from natural causes. His personal archive contained a detailed account of his rescue in the Valith Nebula, photographs of the crystal shard the Elori had given him, audio recordings he had made while still recovering from his fever, and a note he had written to Fleet Command requesting that the record be preserved permanently. The note ended with a single line, "If they ever need us, I hope we answer." Tanaka closed the file. She looked out the window at the stars. She thought about what she was about to do, and she understood that it would either end her career or define it, and she found that she did not care. She opened a priority communication channel, but she did not route it to the Admiralty. She did not route it to Parliament, or the Defense Council, or the Joint Chiefs. She routed it to the Open Fleet Band, the channel that reached every Terran ship in operation, military and civilian alike. Every patrol corvette, every armed freighter, every mining vessel, and colony transport, and retired warship sitting in an orbital graveyard with its engines cold. Every captain with a working radio heard what she said next. Valundra called. They helped us once. 6 words. She did not give an order. She did not have the authority to give the order she wanted to give. And she knew that by the time the proper authorities approved anything, it would be too late. So, she did not give an order. She gave a reminder. And the human race did what the human race does when it remembers a debt. The first ship to respond was a patrol corvette called the Keen Edge, stationed near the outer rim. Its captain, a woman named Torres, sent back 2 words, "On my way." She broke from her patrol route and entered FTL within 4 minutes of hearing the message. The second was a heavy frigate called the Dawn Hammer, which was escorting a trade convoy through the Kovath corridor. Its captain apologized to the merchants, told them they would have to find their own way for a while, and turned his ship toward Valundra. The third was not a military ship at all. It was a cargo hauler called the Old Promise, captained by a 70-year-old man named Davi Marin. Davi had been hauling freight for 40 years. He had been at the bar the night Elias first told his story, and he had never forgotten the look on the man's face when he talked about the Aelori who saved him. Davi Marin looked at his crew of 12 and told them what was happening. He did not order them to come. He told them they could take the escape pods, and he would fly alone if he had to. Every single one of them stayed. They spent the next 6 hours welding gun turrets onto the cargo hull using parts from the hold. And when someone pointed out that a freight hauler had no business in a battle, Davi said, "We can sleep when they are safe." The Old Promise entered FTL with gun turrets still cooling from the welds, and it kept going. The signal passed from ship to ship, and station to station, and bar to bar like fire through dry grass. Captains heard it and changed course. Crews heard it and volunteered. Retired officers heard it and drove to the nearest shipyard and begged for anything that could fly. A group of miners in the Talvis Belt pooled their money, bought a decommissioned destroyer from a scrap dealer, spent 2 days making it barely functional, and flew it out with a crew of 26 people who had never served in the military in their lives. Ships came from everywhere. They came from the core worlds and the outer colonies and the deep stations and the frontier posts. They came from places that had not sent ships anywhere in decades. They came alone and in pairs and in ragged groups that fell into formation as they flew. Nobody coordinated it. Nobody planned it. There was no strategy, no logistics chain, no supply plan. It was the most disorganized military mobilization in the history of the human race. And it was also the fastest. Back on Earth, the Terran Parliament went into emergency session. Half of the representatives were furious. This was unauthorized. This was reckless. This could start a war with the Dominion of Wreck. The other half sat quietly and did the only useful thing they could think of, which was to make sure that nobody tried to stop the fleet. The military brass argued about jurisdiction and protocol and rules of engagement. By the time they finished arguing, the fleet was already gone. 738 ships. That was the final count. Military destroyers and frigates flew beside armed merchant vessels. Sleek, modern corvettes shared formation with battered old warships that had been pulled out of retirement so fast that their paint was still peeling. A luxury yacht with military-grade shields volunteered as a mobile hospital. A fleet of mining drones was reprogrammed to serve as ramming weapons. A retired dreadnought called the Prometheus, which had been sitting in a mothball orbit for 15 years, was powered up by her original crew, most of whom were in their 60s, and had to be reminded how to work the weapons systems. None of them had been ordered to go. None of them were obligated by any treaty or law or agreement. None of them would be paid. Many of them understood clearly that they might not come back. They went anyway, because 19 years ago, a convoy of gentle, glowing beings had stopped in a nebula to save a dying man they did not know. And they had asked for nothing, and a human had promised that if they ever called, he hoped every one of his kind would answer. He was dead now, but his hope was not. Admiral Tanaka stood on the bridge of her flagship, the Resolute, and watched the FTL drives engage, one by one, across the fleet. 738 points of light stretching into lines and vanishing into the dark. She had not slept in 30 hours. She knew that what she had done was probably illegal. She knew that people were going to die. She also knew that she could not have lived with herself if she had done nothing. She gave one final transmission to the fleet before they jumped. No speeches, no politics. Just remember why we are going. Someone was kind to us once. That is all that matters. Tanaka out. The fleet jumped, the stars blurred, and 738 Terran ships raced through the void toward a dying world, carrying with them the full weight of a species that had never learned how to forget. The Rock Hive Admiral was not concerned when its sensors detected incoming FTL signatures. Concern was not something the Rock experienced in the way other species did. The Hive Admiral processed data and assigned threat levels and allocated resources. That was all. 400 warships held orbit above Velundra. Ground forces had already landed on 3 continents. The harvesting machines were being assembled in the ruins of the coral cities. Massive drills and extraction rigs that would bore into the planet's crust and pull out the bioresonant minerals that made this world so valuable. The operation was on schedule. The native population had fled underground and would be dealt with in time. The incoming fleet was an inconvenience. Nothing more. Then 738 Terran ships dropped out of FTL, and the Hive Admiral recalculated. They came out of the void in a ragged, staggered wave that had no formation, no symmetry, and no pattern that the Hive Admiral's tactical systems could identify. Military destroyers appeared next to civilian cargo ships. Sleek frigates emerged alongside battered mining vessels with welded armor plating. A luxury yacht sat between 2 corvettes. A cluster of reprogrammed mining drones drifted in a swarm near the front. And behind them all, massive and scarred, and glowing with the light of engines that had not fired in 15 years, came the dreadnought Prometheus, like an old warrior rising from a long sleep. The Hive Admiral opened a communication channel. Unidentified fleet, you are interfering in a sanctioned harvest. Withdraw or be consumed. The response came on all frequencies, open and unencrypted, broadcast so wide that every listening post in the sector would pick it up. The voice belonged to Admiral Kira Tanaka, and it was calm and steady and carried a weight that had nothing to do with military authority. This is the Terran fleet. We are not here under treaty. We are not here under orders. We are here because 19 years ago, a convoy of Alory stopped for a dying man they did not know and asked for nothing in return. You will not touch this world. You will not touch these people. And if you stay, we will show you what happens when you threaten the ones who are kind to us. The Hive Admiral processed this. The words contained no useful tactical information. They referenced an event that had no strategic significance. The Terran fleet was outnumbered and outgunned, and included a significant number of non-military vessels that should not have been present in a combat zone. The logical response was to attack. The Hive Admiral gave the order. The sky above Velundra erupted. Rock warships moved like insects, fast and coordinated, linked together by the hive mind that gave them perfect synchronization. They attacked in waves, each ship knowing exactly where every other ship was, each weapon firing at the precise moment calculated to cause maximum damage. It was efficient. It was ruthless. It was the kind of warfare that had crushed dozens of species across the galaxy. The Terrans responded with chaos. Not the chaos of panic, The chaos of 700 different captains, fighting 700 different battles, with 700 different ideas about how to win. Military captains used standard fleet tactics. Civilian captains used whatever came to mind. A freighter captain rammed his ship into the side of a wreck destroyer because he could not think of anything else to do, and it worked. A group of mining drones, originally designed to break apart asteroids, flew directly into a rack formation and detonated their charges, scattering the enemy ships like sparks from a fire. The rack hive mind could not model it. Every tactical system they had was built to predict coordinated behavior, to find patterns and exploit them. But there were no patterns. Every Terran ship was an individual decision, and the sheer unpredictability of it broke the Hive Admiral's calculations apart. That did not mean the Terrans were winning. Ships died. The corvette Keen Edge, which had been the first to answer the call, was hit by concentrated fire from 3 rack cruisers, and broke apart in a flash of white light. Her captain, Torres, had enough time to ram the largest cruiser before her ship came apart around her. A civilian transport that had been carrying colonists 2 days ago took a plasma beam through its midsection and split in half. The mining vessel Talvis Star, crewed by 26 people who had never been in a battle before, was swarmed by rock fighters and torn to pieces in under a minute. People were dying, and the battle was barely an hour old. On the surface of Valundra, deep in the caverns, the Aelori could hear the battle through the stone. The vibrations shook dust from the ceilings and made the crystal formations ring like bells. Matriarch Silara sat in the deepest chamber and listened, and she wept because she understood what was happening above her. Strangers were dying for her people. Strangers were burning in the sky so that her children could live. In orbit, the old Promise held its position on the flank. Davi Marin's cargo hauler was never built for war, and the gun turrets his crew had welded onto the hull were already overheating. But Davi did not care about his ship. He cared about the Aelori refugee transport behind him, a fragile crystal vessel packed with thousands of civilians that was trying to reach the far side of the planet, where the bombardment had not yet reached. A rock destroyer turned toward the transport. Davi saw it and knew what he had to do. He pushed the old Promise to full speed and put his ship directly between the destroyer and the transport. The destroyer fired. The first shot took out his port engine. The second tore through the cargo hold. The third hit the bridge. Davi was still alive when the damage reports came in. His ship was finished. He knew it. His crew knew it. He opened a channel to the refugee transport and spoke his last words, with blood on his lips and light from the burning console reflected in his eyes. Get them out. That is all that matters. The old Promise exploded 2 seconds later. The refugee transport escaped. The battle raged for 6 more hours. The Terran fleet was bleeding ships at a terrible rate. 200 vessels were gone in the first 3 hours. The Rock were taking losses too, but their hive coordination let them replace fallen ships with reserves pulled from the rear. And they fought with the cold efficiency of a species that did not mourn its dead. Then the Prometheus made its move. The old dreadnought had been hanging back, taking fire, absorbing hits that would have destroyed smaller ships. Her crew, most of them gray-haired veterans who had served on her decades ago, fought with a precision that came from years of experience and a fury that came from something deeper. Her captain, a retired officer named UN, who had come out of retirement the moment she heard the call, had been watching the Rock flagship for hours, studying its position, waiting for the right moment. The moment came when a gap opened in the Rock formation. UN did not hesitate. She ordered full speed ahead, directly at the Rock flagship. The Prometheus surged forward, her old engines screaming, her hull glowing from the heat of enemy fire. Rock ships tried to block her path, and she swatted them aside like insects. She was enormous and ancient and unstoppable, and she was aimed at the heart of the swarm. The Hive Admiral realized what was happening too late. The rock flagship tried to turn, tried to evade, but the Prometheus was too close and too fast. Captain UN opened a final channel to the fleet. For Velundra, for the ones who were kind. The Prometheus hit the rock flagship at full speed. The collision ruptured both ships' reactor cores. The explosion was visible from the surface of the planet, a second sun blooming in the sky, white and blinding and terrible. The Hive Admiral died. The Hive Mind link shattered. 400 rock warships, suddenly stripped of coordination, became 400 individual ships that did not know how to fight alone. They scattered. They collided with each other. They broke formation and fled. The Terran fleet, battered and broken and burning, surged forward and drove them out. By dawn on Velundra, the rock fleet was gone. The sky was full of debris and drifting wreckage, and the silent hulls of dead ships, both Terran and rock. 212 Terran vessels remained. 526 ships had been destroyed or disabled. Thousands of humans were dead, but below in the caverns, the children were still singing. The Aelori were alive. Davi Marin's last words echoed through the fleet like a prayer that no one needed to be taught. Get them out. That is all that matters. The Aelori came up from the caverns on the morning of the second day, and the world they found was not the world they had left. The coral cities were broken. The great crystal towers that had stood for centuries lay in jagged pieces across the shore, and the silver oceans were clouded with ash and dust. The floating gardens were gone. The libraries were burned shells, their contents scattered like leaves in a storm. 4,000 years of unbroken peace had ended in fire, and the scars were everywhere. But the sky was clear. The wrack were gone, and in orbit above their wounded world, 212 Terran ships floated in a silent ring, battered and burned and barely holding together, standing guard over a planet that was not theirs, for people who were not their own. Matriarch Scylara was among the first to reach the surface. The days underground had taken what little strength she had left, and she leaned on the arm of young Torin as she walked through the ruins of the capital city. Her glow was faint, barely visible in the daylight, but her eyes were open and searching, looking up at the sky where the Terran ships hung like iron guardians. Shuttlecraft were already descending. Terran shuttles, dented and scorched, packed with medics, engineers, and volunteers. They landed in the rubble, and the crews came out running, not walking, because there was no time to walk. They carried medical supplies and construction equipment, and food, and water, and portable shelters, and they started working before anyone told them to. A Terran medic knelt beside an injured Aelori child, and carefully cleaned a wound with hands that were still shaking from the battle. A Terran engineer studied a collapsed coral wall, and began figuring out how to stabilize it before it fell on the refugees sheltering behind it. A Terran volunteer, a young woman who had been a passenger on the luxury yacht that served as a hospital ship, handed out blankets to Aelori families and smiled at them even though they did not share a language, and the smile said everything that words could not. Nobody had signed a treaty. Nobody had negotiated terms. Nobody had asked for payment or permission or credit. They just landed and started helping. Admiral Tanaka came down on the last shuttle. She was exhausted. She had not slept in 3 days. She had lost over 500 ships and thousands of crew members, and she carried the weight of every single one of them on her shoulders. But she walked through the ruins with her back straight and her eyes steady, because the people around her, both human and Aelori, needed to see someone who was not broken. Scylara was waiting for her in what had once been the Grand Coral Archive. The building was half destroyed. Its walls were cracked, and its ceiling was open to the sky. But it still stood, and the Aelori had gathered there because it was the oldest building in the capital, and it felt like the right place to meet the people who had saved them. The two women faced each other in the ruins. Tanaka was tall and dark-haired, and wore a uniform that was torn and stained with soot. Silara was taller, but stooped with age, and her bioluminescent skin flickered like a candle in a draft. They looked at each other for a long time, and neither spoke, because some moments are too heavy for words to carry right away. Silara reached out and took the Admiral's hands. Her fingers were long and cool, and they trembled slightly. "Why?" she whispered. Her voice was rough and broken, nothing like the layered harmony it had once been. "We helped one man. One. Why did you send all of them?" She looked at the ruined archive around them, and the Aelori families huddled in the corners, and the Terran crews already working in the rubble, and the sky where the ghosts of 500 ships drifted in silent orbit. She thought about Elias Voss and his crystal shard, and the story he had told in every bar and every station and every colony until the day he died. "Because that is not how we count," she said quietly. Silara stared at her. Then her glow brightened, just for a moment, a pulse of warm amber light that spread from her chest to her fingertips, and she lowered her head and pressed it against the Admiral's hands, and she did not try to stop the tears that fell from her dark eyes onto the human scarred knuckles. In the weeks that followed, the galaxy watched, and the galaxy learned. The Galactic Assembly, shamed beyond any excuse it could manufacture, formally sanctioned the Dominion of Rock. Embargoes were imposed. Resolutions were passed, condemning the attack on Valundra. Aid was sent from a dozen species who had said nothing when the Aelori were dying, but who now wanted to be seen helping. It was too late, and everyone knew it. The Terrans had come when no one else would. The rest of the galaxy had waited to see which way the wind blew, and then pretended they had been concerned all along. Other species began reaching out to Terran ambassadors in the months that followed. They came quietly, through back channels and private meetings, and they all asked variations of the same question. "Would you do the same for us? Would you come if we called? How do we earn what the Aelori earned?" The Terran ambassadors all gave the same answer, though they phrased it in different ways. "You cannot earn it. You cannot buy it. You cannot negotiate for it. You just have to be kind and hope that we remember." We usually do. On the shore of Valundra's capital city, where the coral met the silver sea, the Terrans built a memorial. It was not made of coral or crystal. It was made of black stone, quarried from Earth itself and shipped across the stars, because the humans wanted it to last in a way that nothing on this planet had lasted, through the bombardment. The obelisk was tall and plain, and carved with the names of every Terran crew member who had died in the Battle of Valundra. 5,219 names. They covered every face of the stone, from top to bottom, in letters small enough that you had to stand close to read them. And there were so many that you could stand there for an hour and not reach the end. At the base of the obelisk, set into the stone, was a crystal shard. It was a replica of the one Silara had given to Elias Voss 19 years ago, crafted by Aelori artisans who considered it the highest honor of their lives. Beneath it, etched in both Aelori script and Terran standard, were Silara's original words. "You were alive. That was reason enough." Below that, the Terrans had added their own line. "You were kind. That was more than enough." Silara visited the memorial every day for the rest of her life. She walked slowly along the rows of names, and she touched the stone, and she let her bioluminescence wash over the carved letters so that they glowed softly in the dark. She learned some of the names. She learned their stories. She learned about Torres, who had rammed her dying ship into a cruiser to save her wingmates. She learned about the 26 miners from Talvis Belt who had bought a scrap-heap destroyer and flown it into battle without a single day of military training. She learned about Captain Yuen, who had driven the Prometheus into the heart of the swarm and ended the war with one final act of defiance. She learned about Davi Marin, the old freighter captain who had welded guns onto his cargo ship and flown across the galaxy because a friend had once told him a story in a bar. She stood in front of his name for a long time and pressed her hand against the cold stone and whispered a blessing in the old Aelori tongue, the same blessing she had once whispered over a feverish human in a broken ship in a nebula full of stars. Years passed. The coral cities grew back, slowly, the way living things do. The libraries were rebuilt. The gardens floated again above the towers. Volundra healed. And in a quiet archive on the restored campus of the Grand Coral Library, a young Aelori scholar named Veshin was conducting research on the battle when she found something that had been filed away in the old Terran records. It was an audio log from the personal archive of Commander Elias Voss, recorded the night after the Aelori had saved his life, while he was still weak, still feverish, still lying in his repaired ship with a crystal shard clutched in his hand. She played it. His voice was rough. It cracked and wavered and sometimes dropped to a whisper. He sounded like a man who was trying very hard not to cry, and not entirely succeeding. I do not know if I will ever see them again, but if they ever need us, if they ever call, I hope we answer. All of us. Every single one. Veshin sat alone in the archive and listened to the recording 3 times. Then she saved it, and she marked it for permanent preservation, and she added a single note to the file in her own hand. Every single one. Outside the archive, the twin suns of Volundra set over the silver sea, and the black stone memorial on the shore caught the last of the light, and 5,000 names glowed softly in the dusk. The waves rolled in and rolled out, patient and eternal, and the coral cities sang their evening song, and somewhere in the sky above, the stars looked down on a world that had been saved by strangers who had simply refused to forget a kindness. The galaxy is a vast and cold and indifferent place. Empires rise and fall. Species are born and go extinct. Stars burn out, and darkness fills the space where light once was. But sometimes, in the middle of all that darkness, someone stops. Someone helps. Someone leaves behind a crystal shard and a few kind words, and asks for nothing in return. And sometimes, years later, when the darkness comes again, a signal goes out into the void, and every captain who hears it turns their ship and answers the call. Not because they were ordered to, not because they were obligated, but because they remembered. And that, in the end, is what it means to be human.